Welcome everybody. This meeting has been called by the Committee for Public Education, which is an organisation which was established previously by the Socialist Equality Party, the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. The CFP has called this meeting as an international meeting. We have participants from Britain, France and the United States, which we're very pleased to welcome those comrades. I'll give a proper introduction in a couple of minutes. The title of today's meeting is The Fight for Educator and Student Safety in the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm going to introduce our panellists today, as well as explain the format of the meeting. Just to introduce myself first, my name is Patrick O'Connor. I'm a member of the CFPE and the Socialist Equality Party, and I'll be chairing the meeting today. We've called this meeting in order to develop a discussion on the implications of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, specifically focusing on the tasks confronting educators, students, and the working class more broadly in the face of this continuing onslaught. The World Socialist website, the publication of our world movement, has defined the coronavirus pandemic as a trigger event in world history, comparable to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In itself, it accelerated and proved to function as a catalyst for accelerating underlying contradictions that have been racking the world capitalist system. We see unfolding in the United States an unprecedented crisis of democracy there, the refusal of apparently outgoing President Donald J. Trump to concede the election, the threat of utilising state forces and outright fascistic forces in the United States to provoke a civil war remains a very real and present threat. The geopolitical tensions which have threatened a third world war have been underscored by the latest developments in the Middle East, with an apparent US-backed Israeli assassination of an Iranian scientist. We see the pandemic leading to a heightening of class tensions internationally. Social inequality has been escalating. Those at the very top, the likes of Jeff Bezos and his fellow billionaires, raking in unprecedented fortunes, while at the bottom, within the working class, further restructuring measures, further attacks on wages, jobs, and working conditions. The limited lockdown and other restriction measures which were imposed internationally at the beginning of the pandemic were quickly reversed, undone, with the demand that the working class must return to work, that there must be no return to total lockdown measures that affect the profit-making operations of big business. The cure must not be worse than the disease became the mantra, not just of Donald Trump, but of the ruling class internationally. And within that framework, the question of the opening of schools and universities became really central. Obviously, if the working class are going to be forced back to work amid dangerous conditions, the schools must be open so that teachers can be effectively sacrificed as childminders to allow working class families to continue to function. So there are many complex political issues bound up with the coronavirus pandemic and the threat the danger confronting teachers and educators internationally. So we hope to have a very open discussion today. The format of this meeting is going to be somewhat different to previous meetings that the CFPE has organised. We are hoping to organise it as a panel discussion. So rather than have comprehensive reports from each of our speakers, we are going to introduce it straight open into the discussion. So we do encourage the broadest participation from everybody here. If you're joining us from around Australia, from around the world, we encourage you to let us know what your experiences have been, what questions you have, and you can ask those questions straight away. You don't need to wait. So you can use that chat box feature. Thank you for those people who have already. Just to report, we have people joining us from Adelaide, Sydney, from regional Victoria, from Queensland, as well as internationally. Welcome a participant from South Korea. I know we have other participants from the United States and elsewhere around the world. So we do very much hope that this is an open discussion where we can learn from the experiences of the Socialist Equality Parties internationally. Joining us today on the panel, we have Sue Phillips, who I'm going to throw to in a minute. Sue is the national convener of the Committee for Public Education. She's a long-standing educator within the primary sector in Australia. She's a member of the Socialist Equality Party's National Committee, and she's also a regular writer for the World Socialist website, particularly focusing on education issues. We're also joined from the United States by Renee Casimeda. She's an educator in California, secondary school history teacher. She's a member of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. She is part of the US Educators Rank and File Safety Committee and has worked to establish rank and file safety committees among educators and students in both San Diego and Los Angeles. She also writes for the World Socialist website, again, particularly focusing on the question of history as well as public education. We're very pleased to have two comrades from Europe, from Britain. We have Tanya Kent. Tanya is a member of the Socialist Equality Party in Britain. She is also a long-standing member of the Socialist Equality Party in Britain, long-standing member of the movement internationally. We're very pleased that she's been able to join us. It's 11 p.m. in Britain, and I know that she's had previous meetings in which Renee has also spoken, actually, amongst educators in Britain. So we're very pleased that she's been able to join us today. Likewise, Comrade Will Morrow, he's joining us from Paris in France. It's midnight there, so we're pleased that he's been able to stay up late for us. Will is a long-standing member of the Socialist Equality Party, previously in Australia, now in France, and he's working as a journalist for the World Socialist website. He's been covering the development of the pandemic across not just France, but also Europe, and has particularly written recently on the growing opposition to the return to work, to the reopening of the schools, including amongst teachers in France. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Before I throw things to Sue, I would like to explain the format of the meeting. If you want to ask a question, use that chat box feature. If later in the meeting you would like to speak to the meeting, that is possible as well. You can raise your hand and indicate you wish to speak, and then our tech team can allow you to unmute. That is, if you'd like to make a contribution, we definitely encourage that. Questions in the chat box. You also may need to just check your viewpoint settings. I'd encourage everyone to click on gallery view rather than speaker view. You should be able to see that. It's like a grid sort of box pattern in the top right hand corner of the black part of your screen, if that makes sense. If you can click on that, you will be able to see hopefully all of our panelists' video at once, as well as the slideshow panel. Sometimes Zoom does maximize itself to take up your whole computer screen, which can make things tricky. If you want to then just minimize, the quickest way to do that is just by pressing the escape key on your keyboard. You may then need to return to the speaker view. We will later be seeing a very short video from on the education crisis in Britain. I'll show that before I introduce Tanya and Will. Displaying that video may then maximize Zoom again, so just be aware of that. You can just click on that minimize button, press the escape key, return to a standard size screen, and hopefully be able to see everything as per usual there. If there's any technical questions, again, you can use that chat box to ask, and we'll endeavour to answer those questions. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Sue. Sue's going to speak on the coronavirus pandemic, the implications of it for the education sector, both in Australia and internationally. So good morning, Sue.
I'd also like to welcome everyone to this meeting, in particular our international panellists and online listeners. Our aim today is to provide a picture of the situation internationally, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in schools, universities, and other educational institutions. We hope to review the growing action and opposition of teachers and students in the schools, the developing strikes, protests, boycotts, and occupations against the homicidal policies of reopening schools. We also aim to deepen our exposure of the role of the unions, discuss the positions of the political establishment, such as the Democratic Party, Labor, and the various pseudo-left tendencies, and most importantly, discuss our own interventions into the situation, the critical fight by the Committee for Public Education, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, and our Socialist Equality parties internationally, who have made central the fight for the formation of educator rank and file safety committees placing the lives and safety of educators and students before profit. We will discuss how these committees have been established, what is their role, what issues have arisen, and how the demands of these committees are to be fought for and achieved. On February the 28th this year, now 10 months ago, the International Committee of the Fourth International, our World Party, posted a statement entitled, quote, "For a globally coordinated emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic." We said the danger of the virus cannot be overstated. The working class must demand and fight for a comprehensive and urgent emergency measures. And above all else, what is required is a global mobilisation. The response cannot be coordinated on a national level. The virus doesn't respect national borders. With the growth of global networks of transportation and economic integration, the virus must and can only be resolved globally. We stress scientists from all over the world must be allowed to share research and technology unencumbered by national interests. Hundreds of billions of dollars must be allocated to ensure universal access to the high quality medical care for all, and workers who face reduction in hours and loss of jobs must be compensated in full for their losses. This, of course, requires a vast redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor. In February, the number of cases worldwide were 100,000, with nearly 3,000 deaths. Yesterday, the number of cases worldwide were over 61 million, with nearly 1.5 million deaths. At the time of the February 28th statement, the US had just reported its first cases. Today, the United States, now the epicenter of COVID-19, has more than 13 million cases and over 270,000 deaths, and that number is rising every day. This situation can only be described as utterly catastrophic. What is taking place is a crime against humanity perpetrated by the capitalist class in every country. Despite warnings by scientists for years alerting governments of such an event, the approach of the ruling elite is that the virus is not a medical or a health crisis, but an economic problem. Their major concern has not been to stop the virus or save lives, but how COVID-19 will impact on their the fortunes of the corporate elite and the financial elite. Any suggestion by scientists, health experts about implementing a policy of elimination was rejected outright by governments and business as an intrusion into profits. What has largely been adopted by governments of every stripe is the murderous policies of herd immunity. By March this year, COVID-19 was spreading across the globe. In opposition to policies of letting the virus rip, the working class began taking action to protect itself against the pandemic. Walkouts and protest actions were organised by auto workers in the US, Canada, strikes and protests in Europe and the UK. In Australia, teachers were passing resolutions in the schools, signing petitions, threatening walkouts and mass resignations for the union, calling for the immediate school closures. This was under conditions where the government and the unions claimed schools were safe. This was under conditions where the most basic protective measures were not available in the schools, not even soap. On March the 18th, the Committee for Public Education posted a statement titled, "Close Australian Schools to Stave Off Coronavirus. Form action committees of teachers and school staff." The statement called for the immediate suspension of the education system, indicted the government and the union for refusing to protect the lives of students and teachers, and elaborated a series of measures to be taken forward by independent rank and file committees. That day, teachers in Melbourne voted to form a safety action committee at Footscray High, independent of the union, employers and the government. Fearing growing opposition of educators and workers, governments internationally temporarily put in place partial lockdowns. In the US, once the CARES Act was passed at the end of March, handing trillions to the banks, the major corporations and Wall Street, a relentless drive then took place to the Back to Work campaign began for the opening of the economy for profit. Central to this pro-business agenda was to reopen the schools. Teachers needed to be back on site, teaching face-to-face, allowing workers to be driven back into the workplaces and factories. In this process, educators' lives were seen as utterly expendable. Driving this agenda was a mountain of lies, threats, misinformation and pseudoscience, all of which was endorsed by the teacher unions internationally, who function as nothing but subservient messengers policing the government dictates. Here, Prime Minister Morrison announced, with the full support of his national cabinet, made up of both state, Labor and Liberal governments, that social distancing, while necessary in the community, was not appropriate or necessary in schools. Students, particularly young students, were supposedly low risk, less susceptible to the virus, don't develop serious symptoms, and did not transmit the virus to teachers. This so-called science and research that these theories were based on was carefully selected to meet a definite political and economic agenda. As we all know, the reality of safe schools in the midst of the pandemic is thoroughly bogus. Where schools were prematurely opened, they have become vectors of the virus. In Britain, a recent report showed 50% of COVID infection have taken place in schools and education institutions. The same is taking place in Germany, Paris, and right across Europe. In the US this month, it was reported that over 1 million children have been infected with the virus, with many hundreds of educators tragically dying, including the premature death of increasing numbers of college students. In Australia, as a part of partial lockdowns, schools in Victoria and New South Wales initially went to online learning. This was a temporary measure. Once the schools started to reopen, with the union celebrating the return to on-site learning, outbreaks immediately took place at hundreds of schools, with both students and teachers being infected. At one school in Melbourne, a cluster of over 200 students and teachers were infected, forcing the Chief Medical Officer in Victoria to admit student-to-student transmission and teacher-to-teacher transmission was taking place. For months, we've been told teachers need to go back into the schools, that we are putting the most vulnerable students at risk, that we were a barrier to their learning and well-being. Alongside raging infections and deaths now spreading across the United States, Latin America, Europe, India and UK, millions and millions of people have lost their jobs, been thrown into poverty and food insecurity, mirroring the conditions of the 1930s. The ruling elite in every country, not wanting to waste a crisis, have seen COVID as an opportunity to deepen the assault on the working class, restructuring class relations overall. Here in Australia, while we have not experienced the numbers of COVID infections and deaths, the government, with the collaboration of the unions, have driven up productivity and workload in the factories and workplaces to untenable levels, imposed wage freezes, cut penalty rates, and eliminated thousands of jobs. This process has been unprecedented on the universities here, where the National Tertiary Education Union have overseen the restructuring of the campuses, eliminating since March close to 90,000 jobs, wage cuts of 10 to 15%, and the scrapping of entire courses. While COVID-19 has wrought devastation and tragedy to the lives of the vast majority of the world's population, this has not been the experience of the billionaires who have more than prospered and enriched themselves over the last year. For example, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, has since March increased his wealth by $70 billion. This is under conditions where over 20,000 of workers at Amazon have contracted COVID. These sickening and graphic statistics of extreme wealth at the top of society and vast growing poverty of the majority are proving that the basic needs of society, including the preservation of human life itself, are completely incompatible with the domination of a few thousand billionaires over society. Such a system has outlived itself and must be overthrown. In the last 10 months, the most politically conscious opposition to the criminal and deadly policies of governments has been led by our party internationally. We have provided analysis and perspective and elaborated this every day on the World Socialist website. In our articles and statements, we have provided a voice to teachers, educators, and students. The urgent call we have made for the establishment of rank and file committees is now being taken up by increasing numbers of educators, students, and workers. In the United States, 8 educator rank and file safety committees have been formed, along 7 auto workers rank and file safety committees. In Germany, through the struggle of students, 2 rank and file committees have been established, and in Britain, we have established a National Educators Rank and File Committee and critically, a Bus Drivers Rank and File Committee. This is only the beginning of what must be taken forward in every single country. I'll conclude there, and I hope I've provided just a brief overview of some of the issues that we shall discuss and flesh out in the course of this meeting. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Sue. I'd like to introduce Renee Casimeda now. Renee, there's a lot of issues in Sue's report. Before we get to the specifics of the coronavirus pandemic and the questions confronting educators and students, I think it would be remiss of us to not report for this meeting on the latest developments within the US political crisis. We've reported on the World Socialist website since earlier this year. President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act in the face of mass demonstrations, which we characterised quite aptly as a coup attempt. The threatened deployment of the US military against American citizens. On November 11, we posted a statement that is following the election from the SEP US Political Committee, Stop Trump's Conspiracy to Nullify the 2020 Elections, in which we characterised his refusal to accept a clear electoral loss and to turn towards layers of the state as an attempt to nullify the results of the 2020 elections and establish a personalist dictatorship. At the same time, we see, of course, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party appeal for unity with these extreme right-wing Republican forces. Biden, of course, infamously during the campaign itself, promised Wall Street executives that nothing of substance would change under his presidency. As far as the global situation is concerned, Biden is now threatening that the United States is back on the world stage and openly looking to engage in confrontations with China and Russia. Could you just update us on the latest? What is the situation in the United States and what is the mood amongst the working class in the United States, if that is possible to sum up?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Patrick. And I just want to say, thank you for having me on this call. And, I appreciate the opening report as well by Sue. Absolutely agree with the conditions that are catastrophic throughout the world. There's no doubt that the political and social crisis in the United States is very stark, and as has been alluded to, has intensified even within the past 48 hours. And just I'll try to be brief here, but to give a bit of additional points on what Patrick has noted, the world knows that the Democratic Party, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they've won the popular vote, as well as the Electoral College by landslide. Popular vote by about 6 million votes, overwhelming majority in the Electoral College. Trump and his right-wing administration is refusing to concede, and continues to do so even when it looks like the trajectory it will not be successful. Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, stated very clearly recently that there's going to be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. He alluded to the precedent set by the 2000 election and, an article in the Constitution. So he clearly has support from his advisors. And, there's not been such a contested sort of transition of power in the US, arguably since the 1860s and the 1860 election with Lincoln. And, Trump, the refusal to, accept the Biden presidency has major implications for the working class here, in the US, but also internationally. As was alluded to, he sought to use the judicial system, the US Supreme Court, to declare voter fraud in a few remaining states that had yet to certify their votes, and essentially use the state legislatures to throw out the popular vote, to input, Republican elector votes in those states. Now, the process of this is set to end early this coming week, and really does indicate that, by and large, Trump will not be successful with this route. Of course, we still don't know, but even if and once it makes it to the Supreme Court, there's very little evidence to contest these state certifications. However, Trump continues to refuse to accept defeat. And, there's been a major, meanwhile, a major reshuffling within the Pentagon to, get rid of major military leaders who have sort of shuddered at some of his policies, and to replace with loyalists to his, attempts at a coup and military aggression. These are individuals who, will not hesitate to any degree of repressive measures on, those who oppose his coup attempts, which undoubtedly will happen if it carries out. And also figures in the military apparatus who would support, war threats with Iran. The Democrats, meanwhile, have treated this reshuffling as essentially, a national security problem, as it tampers with their interests with Russia and China, and are complicit in covering up the fact that Trump's moves mean serious threat to democratic rights and established norms of government in the United States. This is, as has been said, far more because that the threat of, a coup and dictatorship is for the Democratic Party, something that they would support rather than, the eruption of popular protests, mass resistance from below to Trump and his co-conspirators. Because the Democratic Party, their interests lie in that of Wall Street and the military intelligence apparatus. And lastly, I want to just sort of end on the latest developments. There's been in recent days the brutal assassination of a nuclear physicist in Iran, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and this was a very prominent scientist in the country, leader who developed, a kit for diagnosing COVID-19 even. And Trump has responded by posting, triumphant retweets that this is sort of a major, moral and also a physical blow to Iran. Also, we've heard statements of support from Netanyahu. And there is no question that this was a major attack discussed, prepared, and approved by the U.S. government advance. I mean, this follows Secretary of State Pompeo's trip to the Middle East, which involved extensive talks with Netanyahu and also leaders in Saudi Arabia. So, of course, and I'll end with a final point that, we can't make sort of absolute predictions in terms of what's going to happen. As Trump refuses to concede, particularly in light of, legal action through the courts, sort of running into a dead end, the prospect of war, the possibility of, thousands of deaths of troops would be sort of an avenue to nullify a transfer of power. And it's important to sort of sound the alarm here, that Trump, it is possible that he may sort of seek to seize, war powers under these conditions. And whether Biden is inaugurated or not, the threat of war and dictatorship is clearly intensified. Trump has really paved the way for future possibility of such measures, which would be, mean devastating impacts for the working class here and internationally.
And then at the same time, you have, of course, the coronavirus pandemic now getting worse, not better. At the initial sort of first wave, the world was horrified by scenes in New York, field hospitals in Central Park, mass graves in the island. I can't remember the name of that island, I apologise. But now we see the spread of the pandemic throughout the country, not just in 1 or 2 or 3 states, record numbers of infections. Could you speak about that? What is the latest spread of the infections? How's it affected schools and universities in the United States? Sorry, Renee may be having a hard time hearing me. Renee, did you hear that? She might be having some audio problems. I might just throw to Tanya and Will. Before I ask you to speak, I'm just going to show a video which was prepared by the Socialist Equality Party in Britain. Will, I'm going to ask you a question, but just before I do, if I can just remind everybody that if Zoom maximised to take up your whole screen, you may want to minimise again by pressing the escape key or however else you can do it. And also, I should have raised this at the beginning, but if you're sending us a message, if you can, in the chat box, click the blue button and toggle it to all panelists and attendees if you want everybody to see your comments or questions. And we do encourage questions if you'd like to direct anything to Renee, who I believe is having some technical issues that we're trying to resolve just now, but you can do that through the chat box. But Will, can you speak on the situation in Europe? There's actually more infections, coronavirus infections in total across Europe than there is in the United States. In a recent article, you characterised what's happened as a crime against humanity. That is, the ruling class of Europe is guilty of a crime against humanity. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure, certainly. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this meeting. Well, as you say, the situation with the virus is catastrophic in Europe as internationally. It is now a global epicenter of the spread of the virus once again, as in March and April of this year. I mean, on the exact situation now, I mean, the media and governments across the continent are engaged in a major campaign to downplay and underreport the extent of the catastrophe which is ongoing. Yesterday in France, there were another 500 people who died every day. I'm sorry, more than 500. It was 581 people died yesterday. Every day since Monday has seen more than 500 people die in France. On a per capita basis, this would be the equivalent to around 3,000 deaths in a country the size of the United States per day. There are now more than 52,000 people who've died in France alone, approximately the size of a medium-sized European football stadium. And in terms of the continued spread of the virus, there are more than 12,000 people who contracted the virus yesterday alone. The number of cases is still somewhere between 10 and 20,000 every day, new cases. It's down from the numbers that there were at the peak 2 weeks ago when there were around more than 60,000 cases per day. But these are still really catastrophic numbers, a disastrous situation. And this could be repeated in many countries across Europe. In Britain, there were 479 people who died yesterday alone. In Italy, there were 686 people who died yesterday. In Germany, which is actually held up across Europe as a model of the supposedly successful response of European governments to the crisis, there were 100 people who died yesterday. In Belgium, there were 120 people who died. Belgium has a population of only 11 million, so this is approximately the same per capita death rate as in France. In Spain, the 7-day rolling average of deaths is now over 300. The scale of the spread of the pandemic is really staggering. I mean, as you said, there are now more than 17 million people who have contracted the virus across the continent. 386,000 people who have died. The death toll in Britain is now 58,000, more than 58,000. In Italy, it's 54,000. In Spain, 44,000. In Russia, over 39,000. There are, I mean, 2.2 million Russians who have contracted the virus, 1.65 million in Spain, 1.6 million in Britain, 1.5 million in Italy. Yesterday, Germany actually surpassed the 1 million milestone. And healthcare systems are really strained to breaking point, and really under conditions where a further increase in the spread of the virus would threaten them with completely being overwhelmed. 75% of hospital beds in France are now occupied of emergency beds. Though in local regions, actually, the situation is much worse where it's more concentrated. You maybe some of the people here have seen the videos that were widely shared from Italy of the nurses lining up outside, images of nurses lining up outside the hospital in Naples in the south of Italy, providing oxygen to patients in their cars, ambulances queued up outside hospitals, a patient who was filmed dead in the toilets of the hospital ward because there was no room left to treat them. I mean, these are images that have been burned into the minds of millions of people as a symptom of the complete failure, responsibility of governments across Europe to address the pandemic. And I think, you know, there are a number of points to be made about this situation. I mean, the first, as you said, Patrick, I mean, this was not inevitable. I mean, even the use of the term, you know, second wave shouldn't, I mean, it shouldn't lead one to think this is sort of some sort of natural phenomenon, which is inevitable that the virus then resurges. I mean, there were very conscious policies that were undertaken by capitalist governments in Europe to ensure that this would happen. In February and March, as Sue said in the opening of her contribution, there was initially no response to the pandemic. There was essentially no testing. The virus was massively circulating. There were increasing numbers of deaths. And it was only really when there was a strike wave developing among auto and other industrial workers in Italy in particular that were demanding the idling of non-essential production that actually measures were taken to actually stop production and order a lockdown. And then similar measures were ordered in France, Spain. But really the conclusion that was drawn by governments was not that lockdowns are essential to prevent the spread of the virus, but that this was something that couldn't be allowed to happen again. As in the United States, they handed themselves hundreds of billions of euros. There was a major bailout package, which was passed by the European Union, 750 billion euros, but many other packages by national governments as well. And having used the crisis to bail out the major corporations, very quickly then turned to the reopening of the economies, essentially a race by governments across the continent to see who could dismantle all the lockdown restrictions the most rapidly, the reopening of schools, as you said, Sue, to ensure that children could go to school so that their parents could return to work. This was pursued knowing that it would ensure a spread of the virus. And actually, you know, it was very clear there were warnings made by scientific authorities. The World Health Organization published a report in July warning of a second wave, a resurgence of the virus as a result of the easing of the lockdown restrictions. Actually, the Prime Minister of France at the time, the same week that the World Health Organization released that report, basically made a statement saying, we know that lockdowns will prevent the spread of the virus, but from an economic and social standpoint, it's catastrophic. And so it won't be done again. And of course, what they mean by from an economic and social standpoint, it means from the standpoint of the ruling class, from the profit interests of the major corporations, that it couldn't be allowed to happen again. And so a policy was pursued, knowing that it would result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, deliberately, consciously. And it's from that standpoint that we characterize this as a crime against humanity. That's what this has amounted to. I think this video is very strong. You know, it shows that there is enormous opposition to these policies among workers and young people, enormous strikes and demonstrations which have already developed, and anger which is growing. I mean, to the extent that it has, the governments have been able to impose these policies so far, it has depended on the role played by the trade unions, which in Europe, as in the United States and Australia, have really been responsible for spearheading, organizing the reopening policies of the governments. And we may be able to speak again on that later as well.
Yeah, I might, I believe Renee is with us again. Before I throw back to her and then introduce Tanya, I'll just again repeat just for those in attendance, if you have any questions for our panelists, Sue, Renee or Will or Tanya, this is a good opportunity, a rare opportunity to ask questions and to contribute your experiences on the situation. Renee, I was just asking previously about the situation in the United States. We've seen the pandemic go from terrible to catastrophic within the United States. There's now 200,000 plus cases a day, more than 250,000 people killed. And of course, behind each of these statistics is an individual tragedy. I think one aspect of the coverage on the World Socialist website recently has been the reporting of individual cases, including amongst students, teachers. There was an article on the death of a 15-year-old student in Kentucky, I believe it was. Did you want to speak on the impact that the pandemic has had within the working class and amongst educators and students?
Absolutely. I'm sorry for the technical difficulty earlier. But yes, you know, in addition to sort of the absolutely grim statistics here in the US, and also, as you know, as Will was mentioning, you know, throughout Europe and elsewhere, you know, these absolutely are the direct, you know, result, as has been said, you know, of the policy of herd immunity that, you know, are pushed by both parties. They're pushed by the trade unions, and you know, they absolutely follow the interests of the ruling elite, which has absolutely been mentioned. I did want to point to, before I get into some of a bit of the statistics and whatnot, I wanted to point to just a couple of cases to sort of paint a picture. You know, Patrick mentioned the 15-year-old who recently died in November. You know, and she actually was a student who was attending high school. She was attending in special education classes. She has Down syndrome, or had Down syndrome, and actually fought off leukemia last year. You know, so these sort of tragedies, you know, that are unfolding. I mean, she's one of you know, thousands of cases, you know, across the U.S. of children, adults, etc., whose lives are lost, impact, you know, whole communities. Just to give just a bit more information about her, I mean, her mother was infected as well and hospitalized, and you know, her daughter had passed away the day she got out of the hospital. You know, a few weeks ago, I spoke with an Arizona teacher who contracted COVID amongst her colleagues at work in a classroom over the summer school time in July. And this was, you know, they were in person as colleagues teaching virtual summer school. You know, students weren't even on campuses yet. And she lost her coworker. And, you know, that teacher, you know, also impacted, you know, the loss of that teacher sort of impacted the whole community. Her entire family was infected. Her brother died. I mean, so the point I'm trying to draw out here is that, you know, these single deaths that are reported, you know, there's an immense of effect that is felt by immediately by families and school communities and you know, regions at large. Here in the U.S., you know, there's reported, you know, over 240,000 cases that are tied directly to K through 12 schools. You know, the overwhelming majority are directly cases of students. You know, and in the months since July, when schools reopened for the new academic year, there's been at least 50 educators who've lost their lives, also students who've lost their lives. And this is a number that's undoubtedly underreported and on the rise. You know, as in addition to sort of the student who passed away recently, there have been 2 educators in Alabama who passed away in the same week. You know, they were in the same district, and those schools have not closed for in-person learning. And, you know, despite sort of these very grim statistics, the US has about 60% of K through 12 public schools still open to in-person instruction under some capacity. So, you know, either that's limited or a hybrid model or fully in person. And you know, as we've been talking with teachers throughout the U.S. And as we've been seeing in the media, across the U.S., teachers are describing this, staggering conditions in the schools. They're having to buy their own PPE. Safety measures aren't being implemented in the schools, such as 6 feet distancing, mask wearing, temperature checks. And teachers are building makeshift barriers to provide some means of safety in their classrooms. I mean, we're talking with shower curtains, PVC, and the like, and are also faced with, compounded work of teaching not only in person, but also online in those districts that have gone into a hybrid model. And, just briefly, I want to make just a couple more points. In addition to, these stark conditions that teachers are experiencing, we're seeing an overwhelming number of them who are being denied the option to work from home, and essentially being denied their legal rights, through the American Disabilities Act, through leave of absence, and are being pressured and bullied even into working in person. Statements such as what Sue had mentioned, where teachers being told they're being a barrier to their well-being, things of this nature are being told to teachers to get them into the classrooms. And even still, there's about 43% of American teachers who have pre-existing conditions. And sort of lastly, which is the case throughout the world and very starkly throughout the US, is there's an overt attempt to sort of censor cases within the school districts. We have 24 states here who aren't reporting outbreaks in the schools. So this is an overt, deliberate concealing of information as part of the broader Back to Work campaign to force parents into work and students back into the classroom.
Thanks, Renee. Tanya, in Britain, your esteemed Prime Minister Boris Johnson was one of the most forthright advocates of herd immunity at the initial stages of the pandemic, saying that maybe it's best if we just cop it in the chin all at once, a comment that he subsequently tended to walk back from. But can you speak about the situation in Britain, in particularly focusing on, we do have a question come in. The question is, can the panelists explain the role of the rank and file committees? So I know that you've been very essentially involved in the organisation of rank and file committees amongst educators in Britain. Why is it necessary to have new organisations of not just of teachers, but of the working class more broadly?
Thanks, Patrick, and thank you for the question. I mean, firstly, I agree. I'm pleased to be here, and I agree with the comments that the panelists have made. Just before I begin, I mean, you raise the issue of Johnson leading the herd immunity strategy, really, for the bourgeoisie internationally. And if you want to see what herd immunity looks like, you need to look at the education system and what's actually happening within the schools in the United Kingdom. I mean, they are, as we've said repeatedly, the vectors for this virus within the community. There is the issue of ensuring that the economy continues to function. That's one of the primary reasons that schools have remained open. But the other issue is herd immunity, that if you want mass infection of the population, you introduce it to broad sections of the community, such as children who are asymptomatic and are going to spread this and have spread this unconsciously and unwittingly across the United Kingdom. And I think, it's a really important issue, because whilst the propaganda campaign has been that it's all about education, as Renee just mentioned, that children are suffering, they're being damaged is the terms that are being used, the tremendous damage that has been done to the mental health and well-being of children through the very short closure of schools, and that was only a minimal closure in any case. But I think, there's a real reactionary, fascistic, right-wing political agenda that is being imposed on society to children. And I just want to give you one example of how this actually works. I mean, the infection rates in schools are just crazy. They're just exploded. But 876,000 children were isolating last week alone. The highest number of infections are in the 12 to 17-year-old age. We're looking at 50-odd thousand children last week who were infected with COVID officially. And at the same time, one school in the United Kingdom did its own test of its entire school, 500 children, and found 150 of those children were infected with COVID on that day that they did the test, alongside 15 of their staff, all asymptomatic, all not knowing, but of course the risks are that they're spreading it. The death rates escalated. On Wednesday, we had the highest death rate. 678 people died in Britain on that day, which was the highest since May. So what you're seeing is the implosion of the virus. This is a deeply reactionary, fascistic policy. But the real issue is that it is being allowed to be imposed and implemented, and it's been allowed to be imposed and implemented because of the utter complicity of the Labour Party and the trade unions in this criminal setup. And they have been exposed as accomplices to this reactionary agenda. There's a growing hostility and opposition that is emerging within the UK, and as you can see from that video, as well as throughout Europe as a whole. And the role of the Rank and File Committee is to give this deep-seated opposition a political direction and leadership. That was the purpose of it, because we said all along from day dot, from March, when they did go into lockdown, that the unions will immediately, as soon as the opportunity arises or the bourgeoisie demands that the economy is reopened, and that children and workers have to return to the workplace, that they will be complicit in that. And that's exactly what they did. They dropped every single measure for safety in September that they had been lauding for weeks as the only way out of this. They dropped every single measure, and they welcomed the reopening of schools as a positive in the interest of children, and said, well, if it gets out of control, we'll be there, we'll be fighting with you, we'll pull Section 44 against the Health and Safety Act, etc., etc., none of which has happened. But that opposition that existed, tens and thousands in June, when the government tried to reopen the schools, that was stopped by millions who protested, who wrote in petitions and so on. That was blocked, and the unions did everything in their power to dissipate that opposition, to subordinate it to the program of the government. So our Rank and File Committee was established to insist that all the opposition that exists must be independent of the labour and trade union bureaucracy, and in fact in a political rebellion against them, and that measures that are necessary to protect lives and to protect the well-being of workers, including their economic interests, can only happen through independent action, through a united campaign in the United Kingdom and more broadly. And we've developed this as the virus has escalated. Our demands have developed to become far more of a political character for a political general strike within Europe as a whole, linked to other workers, as the only viable mechanism and means, because we've gone beyond minimal safety measures. Schools are now death traps for workers. Look, I work in a special school. I've isolated twice now because 3 of my 6 staff have had COVID. Our caretaker died on Friday from COVID. This is the situation and the conditions that teachers are being forced to work in. I eat my lunch in my car because I can't go into the staff room. It's a horrendous situation. The hostility exists, but at this point in time, the propaganda campaign has been immense, and at the same time, workers have felt isolated, but that opinion is shifting. No one who works in schools thinks this is about education. They're holding pens. None of us can teach. We don't teach. We just childmind, firefight. That's all we do. None of the therapies I've done for years are able to be implemented. We can't take children out to swimming and any therapy at all. We just mind children. And in the process, we get infected, as do children themselves. A 10-year-old special needs child died last week from Bradford, from COVID. I mean, this is what's taking place, and people are becoming angry. And moreover, that anger is turning towards the unions, and there has been all these websites that have been established, you know, parent websites, teacher websites, and so on, what you're seeing is that virtually all of the comments are directed against the unions and their betrayal. And in that situation, in step the pseudo-left and the radicals to dissipate it and subordinate it yet again under the control of the bureaucracy. So we've fought consistently, if people can read, our opposition to a new anti-COVID organisation, Zero COVID and so on, which is all set up by the radicals. Similar, almost identical policies at one level to ours, but all subordinated to the labour and trade union bureaucracy. That's their perspective. They say, well, yes, these measures are necessary, but the very unions who have supported the reopening of the economy and the return to back to work are the ones who are supposedly going to defend workers. And they're doing this because they know that there is an almighty conflict that is brewing and that is erupting. The levels of people who have been victimised is extraordinary. Staff who are actually raising safety concerns amongst their membership are being driven out. Facebook is full of one teacher after another being driven out of the workplace for raising safety issues. These are key issues, and like I said, there is no organised opposition outside of us. And there is a growing interest. You know, we're having regular people who attend all our meetings, who speak, who interview, who comment, who share our material, and the conditions are emerging. And I think at the same time, when we watch what's happening in Greece, for example, and when we see workers in the United States mobilizing, this does give a powerful impetus for workers to, you know, to develop their self-confidence, to be infused by these strikes, and they begin to discuss doing similar actions and so on. So you're having this process emerging throughout Europe, real hostility. Greece has had it, in Germany there's strikes, France has been mass opposition, in the United States there's been opposition, and all of this feeds into the anger and the direction, hopefully, that we want it to. It's a tough struggle because you're confronting fundamental political issues, because people are recognizing this is a struggle against capitalism and the profit system for it to be successful. But this is shifting, but the point of our committees is that they are independent and they provide the only measures that can guarantee the safety and well-being of staff. But it's an extraordinary situation and it is shifting very rapidly.
Thanks, Tanya.
Tanya, can I ask a question, Patrick, a follow-up question? Can you explain the situation with these parents groups who are fighting for a boycott and their approach to the unions, what the response was?
I mean, look, this has been, again, a very educational experience for us. I mean, the boycott, the return to unsafe schools, was established by a parent. I don't think he anticipated the support he was going to get, but it's now got 15,000 members, I believe, and it's and these are parents who did not want to send their children back to school. Which is in the United Kingdom, I think it's the only country on the planet that's actually fining parents for refusing to send their children to school, and then legal action and imprisonment for not returning them to unsafe schools, including vulnerable children, because they are all forced back to school. So it had a broad support because of the level of anxiety. And many contributed, including us. We, you know, all our members of the Education Rank and File Committee participated in that, as well as won lots of support from that group based on the articles that we were publishing on the site, etc., etc. They organised a parent strike on the day of the national lockdown, because the lockdown excluded schools, even though the R rate was 1.8% in some areas, massive explosion of infections, but the government refused to close schools whilst other sectors of the economy were closed and where people were encouraged to work from home. So on that day, the day of the national lockdown, there was a parent strike to express their hostility in opposition to the fact that schools were remaining open under these circumstances. But and we interviewed the organisers and so on, as we've done in the past, about what the aims of this were. We supported the strike and welcomed it as a positive move, and the fact that parents were going to take action against the government. But we also raised that for it to be successful, it had to have broader support, links with teachers, and the position of the admin, not of the necessarily of the readership, but of the admin, but many of them we've discovered are from the pseudo-left. the position of them was to call on the unions to demand that the National Executive, National Education Union, the NEU, the sort of left union in the United Kingdom, implement a number of measures which were not basically their policies, and that was the task of this strike, was to force or call upon support from the NEU. The NEU did no such thing, refused to back any support. There was zero coverage from a single union about this strike. No members were called to support it, walk out in solidarity, nothing of the sort. They sabotaged it, as we said. We published an article explaining the criminal role that the unions played in sabotaging this parent strike. And from that moment onwards, all the posts from the WSWS were blocked. The entire membership of the Education Rank and File Committee has been blocked from putting any posts, not just from WSWS. I mean, I don't normally post WS articles, and I rarely ever post on their site, but I participated in a discussion with a member who was very critical of the unions. She was saying, where the hell are the unions? Why haven't they done nothing? They're useless, etc., etc. And I said, I agree with you. This is a really important question. We need to tap. And I was blocked just for saying things like that, for supporting critical comments against the union. So there's a real attempt to silence opposition, to subordinate this movement. We have written a letter to them demanding that they overturn this ban, this is undemocratic, that parents have the right to choose what policies and what measures are necessary in this extraordinary situation. And we're going to publish that letter because they've not replied, and they continue to ban our members. And what happened, interestingly, is that a number of people published, because regularly people are linking our articles because they are so important. Some people, we don't even know who they are, never heard of them, just their own readers linked an article to the Bournemouth letter from a nurse about the horrendous conditions in the health sector. And these two individuals were blocked as well. One said, where's that article you refer to about Bournemouth? And she said, they've told me I can't publish it. They've removed that article. Why have they removed the article? I have no idea why they've removed it, etc. So there's this whole discussion about why it is that material has been censored, that we're putting on there, that people themselves have put on there because they're so encouraged by it or educated by it or sympathetic to it. But what it indicates is the shift. What it indicates is the tremendous anxiety amongst this section that the trade union bureaucracy is losing control. So they're forced to subordinate it to that. So they take the next level of guard of protection, which is the pseudo-left, who move in immediately to block it. I mean, every other organisation is promoted on there. The SWP get full promotion, the Socialist Party, People's Assembly, Labour Party, all the unions, but no, the WSWS no longer, although we did repeatedly, no longer can have a voice amongst parents who want to fight against closure. So it is an extraordinary situation. It's the situation we confront with the IYSSE and Twitter and so on, and it's a real sensitivity amongst the bureaucracy that a shift is emerging, and that they have to intervene to block it. And the only way they can do it is not by challenging the arguments, is by bureaucratically and undemocratically suppressing any discussion on these issues. So it's a very important experience, I think, that's taken place, and we're opposing it, and we're mobilising our supporters to overturn it.
Thanks, Tanya. I might ask Renee to elaborate on her experiences forming rank and file committees in California. Just before I do that, we are encouraging everyone here to subscribe to the WSWS Educators newsletter. You can shoot us an email via the address that you can see there. You can also subscribe to the Committee for Public Education newsletter. And of course, we encourage you to read the World Socialist website at wsws.org. But Ray, do you want to add to Tanya's comments just then? What have been the political issues that have come up in your work forming rank and file committees in San Diego and Los Angeles?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And before I start on that, I think just briefly, we've outlined here, a few reasons, I should say a few reasons why educators need rank and file safety committees. What role do they play? And as Tanya had mentioned, there's absolutely widespread opposition to school reopenings. And we argue with the formation of these rank and file committees that they have to be, the opposition has to be united. It has to be united in a coordinated way, and not just, amidst schools in a district, in a region, in a state throughout the country, but also internationally, and also across, industry. Workers in education, but also auto workers, et cetera. And Tanya mentioned sort of the role of the union, and it's very clear throughout the United States that the unions are not fighting organizations, and educators really do lack organizations which they control and that they can use to fight back in a coordinated, unified way. And as sort of we've argued that when educators are isolated, which is what the unions have sought to do time and time again, there's no way for them to fully sort of oppose what's happening, particularly, let's say, in the schools, the austerity that they face. A couple other reasons, we're forming these committees, to expose the truth about the spread of COVID-19. As has been mentioned, multiple times, the pandemic is being absolutely downplayed by the entire political establishment. And, it's up to educators, and we're arguing, and we've actually issued statements by our committees here in the U.S. As a matter of self-defense, to really expose the conditions within schools, report on outbreaks, inform the population in the area, particularly in the San Diego Educator Rank and File Safety Committee. We recently issued a statement on precisely that. San Diego County is openly sort of denying the data of outbreaks, not only in schools, but also in businesses. And, of course, this is an overt attempt to maintain the opening of not only schools, but also restaurants, non-essential businesses, and the like. Here in California, there's, we've reported there's 94% of the population in the state of California lives in an area with a positivity rate well over 8%. And this is grounds for, partial lockdowns in the state. And even amidst these conditions, schools can remain open. We've issued, demands that schools be halted under such conditions. And, another sort of aspect, of the committees as well is, that we've received a lot of reports of teachers being victimized against facing retaliation from their districts. And, we really do argue that educators who oppose reopening cannot do so by themselves as individuals. And, it's up to educator rank and file committees to sort of work to defend the whistleblowers and those who seek to expose these conditions in the schools. And lastly, I'd like to just sort of point that, the situation, is not really headed for a return to normal. And I think, as has been sort of mentioned earlier, is that, there's these coordinated efforts of building rank and file committees are also in order to directly oppose sort of these criminal policies that are imposed by the ruling elite, and toward actions such as walkouts or toward coordinated effort toward a general strike. So I'd like to end there, and I did see a question in the chat that I'd like to just respond quickly to, because it has to do with the San Diego Educator Rank and File Committee. We have a high school student who's involved in our committee in San Diego County. and has been really vocal on expressing sort of the stress, the mental health impact on students, but also, you know, on teachers, as she sees, you know, the overwhelm of her teachers. And you know, something to just sort of speak to there is that you know, schools throughout districts in our county, but I know this is happening elsewhere, they're issuing, you know, these sort of standardized tests at the end of the year as sort of a, you know, a check for understanding of the learning that these students are getting. And of course, this will be used to reopen the schools, citing that, you know, there's been massive learning loss. The student in our rank and file committee expressed that she hasn't learned anything, you know, and that's no fault of her teachers. It's just given the situation. And so, you know, these are sort of the things that have come up, you know, issues that have come up that we're seeking to expose and fight against.
Yeah, there are important points. I think it sort of raises the issue of what is our perspective. We're obviously calling for the suspension of school and university systems in countries and communities where there is widespread coronavirus transmission, but we at the same time have a whole suite of demands. The immense resources which are currently monopolised at the top of society should be utilised to support student learning, mental health, well-being, access to high-speed internet and so on. Perhaps we can move towards a discussion of some of those issues in a moment. We do have somebody with a hand up, Mike Head, who's a member of the SEP and also a worker within the university system. Mike, did you want to speak?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And thank you to the speakers on the panel. I think it's clear that educators and students globally have been thrown into the front line of the fight against the pandemic, against the governments that are unleashing it, and against the trade unions and labour apparatuses who are the police force of the ruling class. Now, we have analysed, I'll just be brief, but we have analysed the pandemic as a trigger event of historic proportions, which is accelerating all of the antagonisms of capitalist society and for creating the conditions, indeed, for immense revolutionary upheavals. Now, Australia, at the moment, may not be as affected by the pandemic as other parts of the world, but that can change quite quickly. Here we have seen the Labor Party join through state leaders a national cabinet, and we've seen the unions operate for months in closed-door discussions with the government. So fragile is the political system here, they need to rely upon these forces to eventually get schools reopened against the opposition of parents and teachers. But we see, what we do see in Australia, no less anywhere else in the world, is the pandemic being used to ramp up and take to an entirely new level the restructuring of class relations in favour of the wealthy elite. I mean, here we've seen, you know, among airline workers, postal workers, and young workers in the so-called gig economy, a devastation of jobs and conditions. And also, it is not accidental that educators and their students are on the front line. You know, as Sue mentioned in the opening report, here the National Tertiary Education Union itself admits that 90,000 jobs have been destroyed since March across the university sector here. And this is now being taken to a new level. We've got 2 reports from universities in recent days of what we call spill and fill, where academics are being forced to reapply for their jobs or for fewer jobs than before on lesser conditions. So the perfidy of the union, which has collaborated in all of this and has offered concession after concession, is now being led to a qualitative new level of attack on both the educators and the students. Now, today, it was reported that as of tomorrow, the first charter flight will arrive in Australia to bring international students back to a university. It happens to be one in Darwin, in order to stop the drain of students going to the UK and Canada. So we have a global competition here to fly students in to boost the revenues of not just the universities, but all the businesses that depend upon them. And that itself indicates how quickly this situation could. I mean, I know the situation, what's been reported on the World Socialist website for Britain is just, and America, in university colleges, as well as in the schools, is disastrous. And yet they're flying in students on charter flights to try to, into infected areas, into infected dangers, to try and boost their revenue. So anyway, I just think, to conclude, we can't have any illusions. You know, this is a political fight against an entire economic order and all the agencies that seek to prop it up. Here, like everywhere else, the so-called the pseudo-left groups, their whole message is, no, we've got to rebuild the unions, but they're seeking to rebuild the unions, which have straitjacketed the working class and are working might and main to keep the working class resistance suppressed. So I think educators and students have got are taking a very important struggle, and our fight to give conscious leadership to that through rank and file committees is a very pivotal development as this year and this decade of immense revolutionary struggles unfolds. Just make those points. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think what you raise goes to the heart of why we convened this meeting. We're discussing the international situation, not because this is somehow distant or foreign to the experiences of the working class in Australia, but because Australia is very much bound up with the global crisis. And while it's true that for a whole series of fortuitous events, Australia has avoided the degree of mass infection of the coronavirus as has other parts of the world. Nevertheless, that does not in any way indicate that the Australian ruling class is any more far-sighted, rational, or that social infrastructure is superior to other advanced capitalist countries. I mean, perhaps, Sue, you want to speak about this, and just recalling that the call for rank and file committees was not triggered by the coronavirus, but preceded the pandemic. The necessity for educators, for other workers to form rank and file committees in their workplace to advance their interests independently of the unions. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic provides a real impetus to that, but there are broader issues bound up with the fight for public education in Australia. Perhaps you could speak about some of the inequalities in the system here, the issues confronting public school teachers and students, and more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion so far, there's so much to discuss. But what becomes very clear is that educators are passing through very common experiences. And, you know, Renee and Tanya spoke about the censorship that is being carried out by the unions to suppress any opposition, to suppress data, to suppress the voices of teachers. And it's interesting, one of the reasons why the Committee for Public Education was established is in particular, and the establishment of our own Facebook page, was that when we tried to raise issues or articles from the World Socialist website on union Facebook pages, we were banned. We were kicked off the website, like what Tanya has explained there. And of course, it meant that we had to establish our own Facebook in order to develop a discussion with other teachers. The question of data, I mean, Renee spoke about data and so on, how the various states are suppressing the data. Same situation here. When schools were reopened here and Victoria became very much the centre of the pandemic, Melbourne, in Australia. When schools were reopened, and as I said, you know, celebrated by the unions, this is great, we're back, we're giving stability to parents, teachers, and so on. Immediately, schools started to have outbreaks, and there was no data about this. We had to develop our own data. We had to look at the news, We had to speak to parents. We had to develop our own data of the outbreaks that were taking place. We had parents were ringing radio stations saying, "Oh, my school's closed," and so on. The union produced no data on what was actually taking place in the schools, and the government itself. It was extremely limited of what was taking place. And of course, this was to suppress the anger and opposition that was developing. Now, the rank and file committees, and we've had various questions on that. I mean, firstly, through these experiences this year with the unions, but the experiences of the working class over decades with the unions, it has become absolutely clear that the working class cannot defend anything if they remain trapped within these organisations. They have to develop their own independent action. And of course, these organisations, above all else, have to be democratic organisations where workers can speak about their experiences. In the unions, you can't speak about your experiences. You can't put forward anything that's opposed to the agenda of the union. So the committees have to be independent of the unions, independent of the employers, independent of Labor, Republicans, whatever. And those that are on those committees have to be elected by the members of the committee, respected individuals that will fight to primarily put the safety of educators before profit, before anything else. And of course, this is critical. And as Renee explained, the first priority is for workers in the workplaces or in the working class as a whole is to have information about what is going on, who is being infected, what is the situation in other workplaces, and so on. We, during the September here in Melbourne, this was sort of while there was a lockdown, a major lockdown that took place, we attended a union meeting and the CFPE members questioned the union about their role in the pandemic. And we said, well, why do you agree with the return to work when there's outbreaks in the schools? One school, 200 teachers and students had been infected. And the union's response was, sorry, we don't run the government. We don't get to make the decisions. We don't get the opportunity to agree or disagree with the chief medical officer. Now, in other words, all the union can and is doing is following the dictates of the government. Teachers have no right to question or raise any issues that are against the decisions of the government. Now, if you've got a union like that, well, what's the purpose? What is the purpose of it? So the question of rank and file committees become critical. Now, what Patrick raised before was that, it's not it isn't. The question of rank and file committees is not a question just of the pandemic. There is not going, if a virus is successful and so on, fantastic, but it's not going to be anywhere in the world going back to a vaccine. What did I say? A vaccine.
Yeah, you meant vaccine, yeah.
Yeah. It's not a question going back to what it was before. Governments all around the world have already announced budget cuts. In the United States, the states are facing bankruptcy. So whether the pandemic's here or not, the working class requires rank and file committees, and they have to be developed in advance. Now in Australia, we have one, but we need to develop others. others. You know, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID here at all, but we do know that the working class, in order to defend its conditions, defend public education, requires the independent action of educators, teachers, combined with other sections of the working class. I mean, in Australia, we have one of the most unequal education systems in the entire world, you know. And, you know, Renee mentioned about standardised testing. Here, throughout, you know, throughout this whole year, workload, you know, standardised testing and so on has not really gone away, and all the sort of backward and regressive curriculum policies that are being imposed are being ramped up. It's an opportunity to ramp everything up. And one of the things that hasn't been discussed, and you know, maybe we don't have time to do it here, but it has been the involvement of edubusiness, edtech in the pandemic. They have used this crisis to intrude in every possible way into education, every possible way. That's one of the ways in which Bezos has made his billions, through edtech. Interesting, and intruding on the basis of curriculum, testing, establishing platforms, apps, and so on. And of course, others like Bill Gates, the philanthropists and so on, reimagining curriculum. What is being developed by edubusiness, edtech, is a complete re-landscaping of what education is going to look like. And I just want to quote one thing from a research document which we're preparing an article on. And this is what they say, what education in the future should look like. And one of the things they say, the days of schools being considered brick and mortar institutions is rapidly changing with the emergence of virtual schools. And you now have the development of Pearson and so on, which is now being described as the Netflix of education. I'm trying to find the quote, what they say. I can't find it, but what they're saying is education in the future has to be developed without schools, without campuses. It has to be online. And of course, this is the way that edubusiness is using this crisis to get its tentacles into every aspect of education. The days where teachers may have determined what goes on in the classroom under capitalism today is really changing extremely rapidly. So I think that, you know, if teachers and society as a whole want to develop a high quality public education system, it requires the intervention of the working class and educators independently in the establishment of such committees that will begin to determine what society should be like for the future.
Thanks, Sue. We are going to have to begin to wrap up the meeting. It is getting late in Europe, where two of our panelists are joining us from. Will, just before we do start to wrap things up, can I just ask you to speak on the question of our perspective? Why does the coronavirus pandemic raise, quite objectively, the need for world socialism? You might want to refer, Sue raised the question of the vaccine, which the development of the vaccine and the profit system brings up with it a whole set of questions around issues of nationalism, production for profit. Do you want to speak on those issues?
Yes, certainly. So that's a critical issue. I mean, the development of the vaccine is a development which also points to the enormous contradiction between the extraordinary scientific capacities of humanity and contribution of scientists, and the reactionary impact of the subordination of every aspect of social and economic organization to the interests of the capitalist class today. I mean, you have not only the this earlier case of Moderna with a fraudulent claim of a vaccine in order to boost its share prices, but more fundamentally, I mean, the announcement of the promise of a vaccine, a likely vaccine, is an extremely promising development. Ought to have been the basis for all the more clear is the necessity to ensure that there is a lockdown, that there are no unnecessary deaths before people have the chance to be vaccinated. On the contrary, in fact, this development has been used as the justification to insist that reopening has to take place regardless. The French government has said that regardless of the presence of the vaccine, we don't know when it will be available, so we have to proceed with our policy. The pandemic is by its nature a global event. It doesn't respect any national borders. It requires an internationally coordinated solution. We have already seen in the case of the vaccine the enormous conflicts between national states over who would have access to this, including using it as a geopolitical tool against their rivals. But above all, I mean, what we've been discussing here today has demonstrated that really the capitalist class is not in a fight against the pandemic. It's in a fight against society. It's waging a war in which, you know, the victims are the, you know, millions, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people who are dying as a result of the policies that are being pursued in the interest of the capitalist class. And the development of a response to that in the working class poses a necessity for socialism. You have to have, if you're going to have a lockdown, you have to have enormous amounts of money have to be invested. You have to provide everyone with a decent living condition, with a high living wage. You have to invest enormous resources to address the complex tasks associated with an education system that is online. Investing in more classrooms and buildings so that if there is the introduction of in-person learning, it can take place in very small groups. Massive investment in the healthcare system, of course. You know, the response of governments around the world has been that there's no money for this. Whereas under these conditions, I mean, as Sue raised at the beginning, you know, figures like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk have made, you know, personally tens of billions of dollars in the course of the pandemic as a very direct product of the policies of inflating the stock market, which of course necessitates the maintenance of production in order to maintain the stock market increases. So the resources for this exist, the resources for such a policy exist, but it's incompatible with the interests of the capitalist class. I mean, one of the things that's so striking, I mean, listening in particular, what Tanya raised about the role of the Labour Party, the trade unions in Britain, of course, in the United States. In Europe, it's really identical. I mean, the trade unions have been centrally involved in enforcing the reopening policies. It's really striking. You look at every government in Europe, regardless of the political party that's currently in power, whether it's, you know, the likes of Boris Johnson or Macron, a former investment banker who emerged from the Socialist Party, the Grand Coalition in Germany. In Spain, it's the Socialist Party in government with Podemos, which is a party which we have characterized as pseudo-left, a party which uses left-wing phraseology to pursue the interests of, defend capitalism, pursue the interests of the sections of the upper middle class. like Syriza in Greece. And all of them have pursued the same policies of herd immunity because they all defend the interests of capitalism. So, you know, the perspective that we're advancing, that the Socialist Equality Party is advancing, the International Committee of the Fourth International, is the only realistic viable program to respond to the pandemic. You need to have the massive resources that have to be invested should be confiscated from the wealth of the financial elite. That's necessary for the rational scientific response to the pandemic. Production should be organized under the control of the working population to meet social need. And society has to be organized on the basis of social need rather than profit on an international scale. So I hope, I mean, it's a broad question that you've asked. I hope that points to some of the issues that we've raised in our statements.
It does. Thanks very much. And unfortunately, we don't have more time. It's been a very fruitful discussion, and we're really appreciative of the comrades Renee in the United States, Tanya in Britain, and Will in France. Before Sue makes a very brief concluding remark, I will just urge people to get involved with the CFPE. We're organising this meeting as a means of mobilising educators and workers more broadly. We're not waiting on events in Australia or anywhere else. We're seeking to intervene into the situation and develop the fight to defend public education, to advance the interests of educators and workers more broadly. And that requires people coming off the sidelines and getting active. So please contact us if you're not in regular contact with the CFPE already. I would also encourage everybody here to send us some feedback. What did you think about this meeting? If you have any questions that are outstanding that we didn't have time to raise, you can shoot us an email, cfpe.oz@gmail.com. Finally, we do encourage those of you who aren't already financially supporting us to donate. You need to be careful how you do this due to reactionary electoral laws. If you're in Australia, please donate to the SEP Australia via that link, and the links will be in the chat box as well. If you're in Britain, you can donate to the British section of the RCFI, the Socialist Equality Party, via that link. And if you're in any other country, you need to donate via the WSWS, the World Socialist website, with the link there as well. We know many of you involved in this meeting already support us, but organising meetings like this, developing the kind of practical work that we need to develop, continuing to support the expansion of the World Socialist website, which was recently redesigned and relaunched, all does require financial resources. And so if you can make a regular contribution, that's very much appreciated. Alternatively, just a one-off is also appreciated as well. So that, as I said, the links, the hyperlinks are there in the chat box. But we thank everyone for your participation, and we'll throw to Sue to conclude the meeting. If she wants to, no obligations.
I think you've concluded it, Patrick. No, I mean, look, we just really would like to thank our international panelists, Renee from the United States. What an extraordinary situation unfolding in the United States, and the work that our party is carrying forward there is really groundbreaking. So there were probably many, many more questions and points that could be discussed, but obviously these meetings will continue. Thank Tanya also for staying up for so late. 2 meetings for her today. I think the situation in the UK, what Tanya has described, and the coming together of sort of parents and young people participating in our educator rank and file committees that are now being held every 2 weeks is very critical. I would say to everyone here, if you would like to participate in the call-in meetings in the United States or UK, you are more than welcome. And in fact, we encourage that participation of international people. And thank you, Will, for your contribution from France, Paris. Looking at the news over the last few days, there is a very explosive situation developing beyond the pandemic, and we've noted over the last few weeks in particular, French teachers taking strike action, young people blockading the schools. This is a critical section of the European working class, and we know the party's role in that is critical and developing. So we want to thank all our three speakers. Thank you very much. Please, if you haven't signed up for any of the newsletters, please do so. And we do have regular meetings of the Committee for Public Education here. So if you'd like to continue the discussion, then please let us know, and we will be in contact. So thank you very much for your attendance and your contributions financially too. Thanks a lot, comrades.